A large white rock lay beneath a huge pakor tree at the edge of Monisha's village. By standing on it, Monisha could look over the levee and see the men casting their fishing nets into the pond. Everyone in the village called the big rock Gach Pator, but that was the only thing about it they could agree upon. Monisha's ma knew that her daughter had inherited her own restless mind, and shortly before she died of fever, asked Monisha to find out what the Gach Pator really was. In a moment, both she and Manu were cross-legged on the platform as Bipod swung his instrument under his arm and declared, looking at Monisha, that his next song was for the Baul Princess of Birbhum, and began to sing, "Oh, my mad friend, there are in Kenduli abodes of the poets Joydeb and Chondidash. Goresh Nolhateshwari resides in Nolhat, and the sage Bhamakappa made Tarapit famous. There were giant trees in Labpur that had turned to stone. There was a giant forest in ancient times that now sleeps stone underground." There was no question of sleep for the newly crowned Baul Princess of Birbhum. All she could think about were the wonders of her realm as Bipod had described them in his song. The stone tree, Bipod song had mentioned something about that too, an ancient forest in which trees had turned to stone, and not just a single tree like in her village, but a whole forest of trees. Perhaps tigers had lived there too. Quickly she scampered up a tree to overhear what they were saying without being observed. 2 conversations were going on. "At this rate we'll get through the top pebble layer in about 10 minutes, said one of the men. "The sandstone is below that, and that's where we found water just above the clay layer in the other wells. Mind you, we often have to drill a bit deeper these days, so we might have to go to a lower sand." Slowly, Banidi told Monisha that there are several different ways of looking at the world. It was not for her to say whether the priest Abdul Kaka or the old Adivasi man were right or wrong, but that the surest way to find the truth is to discover it for yourself. Clearly, that was what Monisha was already doing, asking questions and then looking carefully to see whether the stone logs themselves provided the answer. Suddenly, shortly in front of her, part of the cliff gave way and crashed down into the torrent now flowing in the central channel. Where the top of the cliff had previously been, there was now a huge light brown stone log sticking out proudly from the bank, left stranded in place after the rest of the cliff had collapsed around it. As Monisha stared at the cliff face, she began to trace different layers, piled up like a stack of flatbread, each one differing slightly from the next. The top layer was made of coarse pebbles with a hard black crust. That was the floor of the eucalyptus forest. Next below was a layer of yellow crusty sand that looked like the bottom of the tea kettle in Bosha's shop. Monisha could see what looked like ancient tree roots within the yellow sandy layer. Tree roots could also be turned to stone. Below that was a thin layer of sticky red and blue clay that coated Monisha's legs as she slithered over the slope down to the log. That was underlain by another layer of pebbles of all sorts of different colours and sizes, some of which were round while others were sharp, all jumbled up together. The stone log was poking out of that layer, and as Monisha looked closely, she could see other broken pieces of stone wood amidst the pebbles, some much smaller than her huge log. But the stream that carried her log and the big pebbles could not have been a small nullah like the one now in the ravine below her. That would have been far too small to move a log as large as hers. No, the flow in which her log once rolled, before it was turned to stone, would have to have been a big river. The landscape was almost perfectly flat, but every now and then there was a small mound that from the distance looked like a man lying down on the kauai. Monisha noticed something white in the nearest one, and as she ran towards it, she knew she'd found another stone tree. So here it was at last, Monisha's stone forest. She spent the rest of the day running from tree to tree, looking for the best one. A splinter had cut into her finger as she grabbed the post, and so she soaked her hand in the warm water. Monisha then tried to grip the splinter with her teeth, but as she did so, she felt it crumble into small pieces of grit. It felt like she'd just got a mouthful of sand. But what kind of wood is made of sand? Suddenly, after all these months of questions, Monisha understood. Hot, salty water was soaking into the log, but as the hot water of the pool evaporated, so the salty minerals carried in the water began to form hard crusts, just as the crust inside a tea kettle forms when the water boils away. Ever so slowly, the soft wood was being replaced by these hard minerals as the hot water evaporated. It wasn't a snake at all. It was the tip of the trunk of what seemed to be a young elephant. This was quickly confirmed by a glint of white that suddenly flashed in the moonlight, part of a stubby tusk. But after coiling the tip about a peanut that was lying just inside the hut, the short trunk was quickly pulled back. The animal had been startled by the noise of Monisha's bare feet on the earthen floor. Something shimmered on the plain before her, and Monisha realized that she had reached a series of small ponds. Several tiny deer with faces like rabbits were drinking from them, but Monisha also thought she caught a glimpse of something that seemed to be a massive deer with big antlers. Its neck seemed to stretch up high into the crowns of the smaller trees. Each of the animals she'd seen resembled ones that she'd heard of or seen in pictures, but each was different in some special way. Here, the elephants had 2 pairs of tusks, and the ape had long fingers and toes but no tail. The deer's neck was far too long, and the hippo's face looked like that of a horse. Even the stars seemed slightly different. Monisha felt certain that her travel this evening was measured in years, not in miles, and that the number of years she had travelled back must be very great indeed, thousands, lakhs, or perhaps even crores of years, long before any human walked in this place. Reason told her that the stone forest was alive again and that she was standing within it. Monisha struggled towards the upper parts of the tree, but her climbing was no match for that of a tiger, and she gasped in terror where she felt the warm breath of the animal snarling immediately beneath her. This was it. Suddenly, she felt a strong shudder and heard a loud cracking noise from below. The extra weight of the large cat was too much for the tree perched so precariously over the river. It was then that understanding and not fever flooded over her. This was the same knot she'd been gripping when the tree collapsed into the river. The stone tree now resting by the village pond must be the same one that she and the cat had just been climbing. "Bring Abdul Kaka and Master Moshe here," Monisha said, quietly but firmly as Baba tried to soothe her. "I've something I want to talk to them about." It was Manu who ran to fetch them.
অবশেষে সকল জনে আশা নন্দন কয় এই মাটিতে দেখে যাবেন কবিগুরু রবীন্দ্রনাথের শান্তি নিকেতন, যে তাই আমি লোকিয়াম ছাতিম বনে, রোদের সোনা আলোক নাচে, আবার রাঙা ধুলাই বসাই মেলা ভবন ডাঙার মাঠেতে। দেশ বিদেশের মানুষ ও যাও এই বীরভূম ঘুরে, ও যাও এই বীরভূম